And live from the internet, it's
Friday Live.
right. We're live, in fact, from Brussels because all of us are in Brussels. And today we have a very special guest, Roland, who's a very experienced person in think tanks, communication. He's been in the Konrad Adenauer Foundation, the Martens Center. He's been working on a range of policy, and he currently has globsec. And we're going to talk about this in a minute. But first, last week you came back from Kiev. Obviously, these are historical and dramatic times. How was your experience, and what do you take back with you from there?
Well, Phil and Leora, thank you so much for having me. It's a great honor and a pleasure. And yes, I spent 4 days traveling last week, out of which 1.5 days in Kiev itself. I felt like I was not only traveling to a country and a city that's the victim of Russian aggression. I had the feeling I was looking at the birthplace of a new Europe, which fights for its democratic future. And you know, Kiev is this wounded beauty. Kiev is a fantastic city. I've been there so many times. To see it now in this war, I mean, the sun was shining, the people were trying to live normal lives, but you can see the city is at 25% of its citizenry at the moment. There are no traffic jams at the moment in Kiev. Half of the shops are closed. But yes, you do see people in cafes. Children are playing in playgrounds. And yet there is this underlying sadness that you feel everywhere. And this big question, when will we ever be able to live what we define as normal again? And I mean, it's this human side that touches you most when you go to Kiev these days. And that was the major emotional takeaway that I had last week.
Now, obviously, we're hearing about this conflict, this war every day in the news. We have images from broadcasters and from social media. When you came there, how different was it from what you were expecting? Was it the same thing, or did you think like this feels surreal? I've heard so much about it, and suddenly I see it. Or is it this doesn't feel like what I'm reading about? Because obviously there's always the press story and the reality, and I'm just curious to see how you experienced it.
Look, media tend to dramatize. I mean, this is their function, right? So when I was thinking about the trip before, I didn't even tell my mom, right? I told her after I returned, because what I'm alluding here to is the danger aspect of it. It's like, did our group put itself in danger? And the feeling from the outside was, it's a hard decision to take. And yes, we were nervous going in. Once we were there, once you're through the first couple of air raid sirens without any explosions, you very quickly lose this queasy feeling in your stomach, right? And I think the feeling that, yes, it's a country at war. Yes, there is, of course, a marginal risk of missiles going into Kiev. There is also a risk of sleeper cells, still Russian agents committing sabotage acts and killings. But none of this materialized. And so, after this, I feel like the situation in Kiev is much less dangerous than it seems to be when you watch BBC World, for example.
Yeah, because obviously we're focused on bombs and people dying and the actual scenes of terror and destruction. One thing you mentioned is, I guess there's a kind of normality in the sense that people have adapted to this ongoing conflict. There was a study of the Blitz during the Second World War in the UK, where apparently people said that after a certain point, people actually become immune to the bombs. They were being bombed on a regular basis. And there were two things happening. First is that it's just no longer extraordinary and you just keep functioning. And the second thing is, in fact, people start recalibrating the danger and think, well, actually, it's not necessarily going to happen to me. So I work. So was there a feeling of normalcy, or I mean, because these are extraordinary times, and for us, it's inconceivable to think of being like that. So I'm just what do you?
Absolutely correct. I think this is the effect that we all experienced in our group, and of course, the thing that keeps the Ukrainians from actually going back to normal is not only the danger and the war, it is the economic impact. I mean, Ukrainian GDP went down by 50% so far, and it's still almost in free fall. Millions of people lost their jobs, and the people that fled know that they're not going to return to the same country anymore. I mean, this is the other thing that, of course, we don't feel, because we're foreigners. We have our jobs. We can return to our safe lives here in Belgium. But for Ukrainians, it makes a real difference.
Now, there's been obviously, the way we experience the war, which is online and with the news reports. What is your take on, that conversation? We've discussed this a few times with different guests. It feels very much like the Ukrainians are doing a really amazing job at telling their story. Do you think they're doing such a great job, or is it more that we're getting confirmation bias and we're looking at that, so it's kind of the same thing, and there's another story that we're missing? What's your take on that?
Yeah, the Ukrainians are doing a fantastic job, and it starts with President Zelensky's olive drab T-shirts, and by the way, no one in Kiev wears ties anymore. The foreign minister received our group in a timber style shirt sleeves kind of outfit. Most officials, half of the members of the parliament that we met, they wear olive drab kind of quasi uniforms, right? I mean, this is just one example. The way the president talks, he's got fantastic speechwriters, and they are trolling this cold Kremlin style fantastically by doing exactly the contrary. That's one thing. I mean, but if you want to look at Ukrainian mastery of communications, you can go back to 2014 and the way that Ukrainian civil society preceded Ukrainian authorities by orders of magnitude in debunking Russian narratives about the Crimea and Donbass conflict. It was the organization called Stop Fake, which actually paved the way. They kind of invented the organized debunking of fake news. And Ukraine was absolutely leading, and within Ukraine, it was civil society and not the government that was an avant-garde in every sense. And so ever since then, Ukrainian civil society has been extremely good at using social media in countering fake news, countering targeted disinformation, countering trolls, and countering the radicalization of also Western societies with very, very smart techniques and policies, and a lot of effort and a lot of volunteer effort that went into this. So I think Ukraine today is probably the world champion of a modern pushback against the authoritarian misuse of information and of social media.
Yeah, I think that's a really very interesting observation. And now there's one question that I'd like to return to, which is, how much of this is just a happy coincidence that they had the right people with the right cultural frame and the right tools to be able to do that, because it doesn't look like any of this was planned. It happened. It was triggered by the events. And the second thing is, how does this fit in the bigger narrative, which we heard since 2016 and before, which is social media is creating polarization, disinformation, all things horrible. So how do you think, what is the Ukrainian accidental genius of communication, or was it something that they actually really built up and worked towards? And do you think what do you think of the bigger frame?
Why are the Irish so good at talking? Because they were the underdogs in a conflict with their wealthier, militarily more powerful, and rather colonialist neighbor. Now, I'm not comparing Russia to Great Britain, but I do compare Ukraine to Ireland in this sense of being weaker in a couple of categories and therefore having to be stronger in something else. And this something else certainly was communication, was style. But I mean, heck, Ukraine is a free society. That's another important aspect. Russia is a dictatorship now. Russia is becoming totalitarian by the hour. Ukraine is a free society and wants to remain one. And this is a fantastic motivation to use social media. But coming back to the more abstract part of your question, before the narrative that social media are radicalizing us and splitting our societies and so on, there was another narrative, and that was social media are going to weaken and ultimately destroy all the dictatorships of the world. Now, that was not true. Exactly, the pendulum of the debates swung precisely the other way with the narrative that you presented, that now it's the authoritarians that are leveraging social media against free societies. Look, ultimately, I think the truth is exactly smack in the middle here. It depends on who you're talking about. It depends on which country you're talking about. And of course, authoritarians, autocracies have used social media, but also big data, also generally information technology in every way to their own advantage, much more than we ever feared in our worst nightmares 10 years ago. On the other hand, the subversive, in a positive sense, subversive character of social media, destabilizing rigid societies more than free societies, is also true. I think the jury is out ultimately. And this is the fight of our generation, Phil. No, your generation, Phil and Liora. I'm a bit older than you guys. But this is the fight of our century, to put it now, aside from generations. This is the fight of the century. Will we manage to utilize information technology to help the cause of freedom? As I said, the jury is out, but the battle is not lost. We have become more cautious than the very optimistic attitude that we all had 10 years ago, 15 years ago. But as I said, there's still a good chance of winning this.
Yeah, I think it's and the whole narrative around the internet, has always been, for me, the reality is that it reflects society and it reflects trends and different things, and it's just not fixed, and it keeps changing. And so I think it's just never going to be a fixed point. It'll depend on who's engaging, but it becomes a big ubiquitous, and it basically changes all the key conversation, the key perceptions that we have around these topics. Yeah. Actually, Lior and I went to Kiev 2 years ago, and we were on Maiden Square, and there was a metro station, and underneath that there was a restaurant which was themed barricades. I don't know if you came across.
I don't think I've been there, but I can just visualize. I can imagine it.
Yeah, and the entire story of the restaurant, which was a kind of very designer restaurant, was basically about protest. Lior, what did you take away from that visit to today?
That visit to today. Well, that was a very surreal visit. So I have very specific memories about Kiev as a result. But well, you surprised me.
Well, I think there was another question that I wanted to bring to the discussion we had just before, because when we went, we called it Kiev. And I think this is, it might seem incidental, but actually sometimes these things have much bigger meaning. So maybe Roland, you could tell us, what is the difference between Kiev and Kyiv? Because we didn't know actually that there was a meaning behind it. And of course, now everybody's using a different, is using the pronunciation. What is it? Does it matter? And what should you say?
First of all, I think it matters a great deal, because
Right.
it gives a hint on where you stand in this Russian aggression against Ukraine, and the Russian claim that Ukraine doesn't even really exist as a nation. So all this is implied in the way you pronounce the name of that wonderful city. So Kiev is the Russian pronunciation, and it's the traditional transliteration of the Cyrillic way of writing the city in Russian. And Kiev is the pronunciation of the Ukrainian way of saying the name. And it doesn't sound like much of a phonetic difference, but politically it matters fantastically. And the fact that we're, like, contrary to 15, 20 years ago, today, where most of us are using the Ukrainian spelling or the transliteration of the Ukrainian spelling with Kyiv, and we pronounce the city closer to the Ukrainian way of pronouncing it, that's a political statement. That is a statement that we support Ukraine's nationhood. And of course, it's defensive war against the invasion. So it's terribly important how you pronounce the name of that city.
Right. No, I think that's very, very good point. And, it's become clear now. I think most people are using the Ukrainian pronunciation. Whereas I think before people were slightly less, more indifferent, or at least it wasn't something that they felt they had to do. Now, in terms of the future, I'm curious about your organization, globsec. You're talking about ideas shaping the world. What ideas are you taking out of this conflict, and how can you actually, you yourself as an individual, as an organization, and the people listening to this who are communicators, how can they be part of solving these problems, or at least helping improve the situation?
And if I can add to that, maybe if you can answer that as well, what can we do against the fatigue that is playing up with this whole war, where people are seem to be less and less interested when the news is talking more about national issues again, when it comes up less in conversations outside of Ukraine. What can we do to keep it on the agenda and keep it front of mind and keep people wanting to act, and also help refugees, for example?
Yeah, well, starting with you, Liora, I think the interest comes and goes. I mean, I still get up every morning asking myself, okay, what has happened during the night? What has happened in the early morning on the battlefront? But I reckon that I'm not representative of the majority of people, but the majority of people will sporadically tune back into Ukraine's defense and Russia's aggression as soon as there are dramatic news. So that's one thing. But on going back to Phil's question about globsec and what's our take on this whole thing. Look, globsec is as we call ourselves, the constructive voice of Central Europe in the Brussels bubble. globsec is based in Bratislava with its headquarters, but I've been tasked with building up the Brussels branch of globsec, and I'm seven months into this now. And we want to be we want to bring Central European attitudes and strategies into the Brussels discourse, because we feel that they've been lacking over the last 30 years since Central Europe, or 20 years since Central Europe started playing a formal role in the European Union and NATO. So 3 takeaways from the more policy and strategy perspective here. First of all, we must do everything to support Ukraine so it can win the war. That sounds a little bit 19th century, winning wars. I mean, even a couple of years ago, the classical attitude, especially in this town, Brussels, was that wars cannot be won. right? Wars are just horrible. They have to stop as soon as possible. And actually, every problem on the planet is ultimately, no, this is very German. Every problem on the planet is ultimately a result of misunderstandings and misperceptions. And with you know, a lot of patience, a bit of money, and a good talk over a cup of fair trade herbal tea, you can solve every problem in the world. That was the attitude. This is over. This is the past now. And even here in Brussels. So, you know, I admit the Central Europeans have a told you so attitude. And, you know, Central Europeans, or hawks like me, being German, I'm half Central European anyway. So hawks like us have been belittled, ridiculed, labeled cold warriors, considered old-fashioned, stuck in the 20th century for so many years. You know, I think some West Europeans, some people in Berlin, Brussels, and Paris owe us an apology, right? And that apology still hasn't come. Anyway, so the first point, and I'm too long here, have to speed up. So the first point is help Ukraine win the war, and it does make sense to defend yourself with weapons. And then once you know this, give the Ukrainians the best weapons you can. Second, they certainly deserve candidate status at this point, which is not the same as membership. And everyone knows that. And the Ukrainians that we talk to themselves are totally aware of this. But they deserve candidate status. And please, no beating about the bush here, and no saying that there is no fast track to candidate status and so on. You know, that nation is fighting and dying for all of us, for the basic values that this union is built upon. This union, and this is my third point here, we need to talk about the narratives around the 8th and 9th of May. And Putin has tried to capture the 9th of May narrative, the, you know, anniversary of the victory in the Great Patriotic War over Nazi Germany. Right. I think the West and Ukraine jointly have managed to repossess this narrative this year by saying never again means not only never again Nazi genocide and never again Nazi aggression against the rest of Europe. It also means never again Russian empire riding roughshod over its neighbors and denying neighboring countries their existence and their identity and their sovereignty and their freedom and their ability to determine their own future, their alliances, their checks and balances, their democracy. So, you know, this is all contained in the never again, which is the basis, the fundamental and founding fathers narrative of European integration. And it has to be applied to this war. So that's the third takeaway for me.
Thank you. No, I think that was extremely interesting, and you know, I think a lot of these questions we all need to reflect on. I think, and people need to take responsibility and take action when they can to basically play their part in solving this conflict. And I think you raised some fascinating points. We're going to continue the conversation online. Thank you very much for joining us and for sharing your views, your experience, your insights. Have a great weekend in this sunny Brussels, and we'll see you online if we don't see you before.
Thank you, Roland.
Thank you, Roland. Bye-bye.